It all began that summer when my mom went to visit her sister for a few weeks. Although it wasn't the first time she'd left, this time felt different. Dad and I had never spent this much time together alone. I was 22, old enough to live my own life, but the pandemic had brought me back home. The isolation made things awkward between us. Silent dinners, long pauses, and brief, uncomfortable chats. At first, it felt like we were two people making too much effort to get along. I knew my dad cared about me, but we'd never been close in a way that went deeper than polite exchanges. We didn't have much in common. My interests were in art and books, while he was a quiet, practical man who spent his time fixing things around the house. It was one of those hot afternoons when everything began to change. The living room air conditioner had broken, and the heat was unbearable. Dad decided to rearrange some old furniture to make room for a fan, and I offered to help. During the process, we uncovered some dusty photo albums tucked away in a forgotten corner. As we sat on the floor flipping through them, we laughed at the old pictures. Me as a toddler, him and Mom in their early years. Something about those moments brought us closer, as though we were peeling away years of distance, revealing a gentler side of him that I hadn't noticed before. "You were always so attached to me when you were little," he said, laughing as he pointed to a photo of me clinging to his leg. I smiled. "Guess I grew out of it." "Maybe," he muttered quietly, almost with a hint of longing. I noticed the way his hand lingered on mine just a second too long when he handed me the album, but I let it pass. After that day, something shifted. We started having long talks about life, regrets, dreams, things I never expected him to open up about. He shared parts of himself that made me see him not just as my father, but as a person with his own vulnerabilities. I started to look forward to our time together. It felt good to have his full attention, a warmth I didn't realize I had been craving. Maybe it was the absence of Mom that made us both more open, more vulnerable. Whatever it was, it felt new and unsettling. One evening, after watching an old movie on the couch, my head resting against his shoulder, his arm around me felt different. Not inappropriate, but undeniably close. Too close. I knew it was innocent, at least for now, but the comfort we found in each other was starting to blur a line. The next few days were filled with unspoken tension. We both sensed something was changing, but neither of us addressed it. We filled our time with simple tasks, fixing old appliances, cooking together, watching TV late into the night. But each moment felt charged with a kind of intimacy I couldn't fully understand. One night, the power unexpectedly went out, plunging the house into complete darkness. The air was thick and humid, and without the fan, the heat became unbearable. We sat together in the living room, lit only by the soft glow of a candle. Dad leaned back on the couch, exhaling deeply, and I ended up sitting beside him, our shoulders touching. "You doing okay?" he asked, his voice low and comforting. "Yeah, just tired," I replied, though it wasn't just exhaustion that weighed on me. It was everything. This strange closeness, the way his presence both comforted and unsettled me. I rested my head on his chest, and without a second thought, he wrapped his arm around me. It should have felt normal, even innocent, but it didn't. It felt too natural, too easy. I could hear his heartbeat beneath my ear, and somehow that made me feel safe. We stayed like that for what seemed like hours, the world outside silent. In that darkness, it was just the two of us, closer than we'd ever been. I knew I should pull away, create some space, but I didn't. I stayed, soaking in the warmth of his embrace. "You remind me of your mother," he whispered, suddenly breaking the silence. I tensed for a moment, unsure how to respond. "How so?" "Just the way you are. The way you listen. It's nice," he admitted, his hand brushing my arm lightly, almost absent-mindedly. There was something in his tone that made my stomach twist. Not with fear, but with curiosity. He wasn't being inappropriate. Not exactly, but there was an undercurrent in his words that I couldn't ignore. "Thanks, Dad," I whispered, my voice softer than I meant. He gave a small smile, and in that moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes, something that scared me because it felt familiar. It was the look people give when they feel truly seen by someone else. I pulled away slightly, just enough to sit up, but his hand stayed on my back a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't wrong, but it was something I could feel. Like the lines between what was appropriate and what wasn't were starting to blur. And I knew he felt it too, but neither of us said anything to stop it, not yet. The next morning, I woke up with a strange heaviness in my chest, the weight of the previous night hanging over me. Nothing inappropriate had happened, but the unspoken tension between Dad and me was impossible to ignore. It felt like we were circling a boundary neither of us had defined, one that, if crossed, would change everything. He was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, flipping pancakes as if nothing had happened. He smiled when he saw me, but there was a subtle change in his expression. Something softer, more focused. "Morning," he said warmly. "I made your favorite." "Thanks, Dad," I said, sitting down at the table, feeling awkward and unsure. The memory of resting against him in the dark felt too vivid, like it had left an invisible mark between us. We ate in silence for a while, the sound of forks scraping against plates the only noise between us. It was too quiet, too heavy, as if we both knew there were things we weren't saying about the night before. I started hesitantly, unsure how to voice it. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Yeah? I just, I don't know. It felt nice," I said, my words unsure. I know it was nothing, but it felt... My voice trailed off. He set his fork down and looked at me, his gaze steady. "I know," he said simply. That was all, but it was enough to make my heart race. There was no accusation, no regret, just quiet understanding. And that made it worse. It would have been easier to dismiss it if one of us had denied it. But instead, we had silently agreed that what we shared was real, even if neither of us understood what it meant. The rest of the day dragged on, and I tried to stay busy. I went outside to water the plants, cleaned the living room, even rearranged my room. Anything to distract myself. But no matter what I did, my thoughts kept drifting back to him, to the strange connection that had formed between us that evening. While I was folding laundry in my room, Dad appeared at the door, leaning against the frame. "Need some help?" he asked. I shook my head, but he stepped in anyway, sitting on the edge of my bed as if it were the most natural thing in the world. We talked about mundane things, chores, the weather, what to have for dinner, but there was an unspoken energy between us, something simmering just beneath the surface. At one point, while I was reaching for a shirt, our hands brushed, and we both froze. It was such a small, insignificant touch, but it felt like everything. I looked up, and for a moment we were suspended in time. Two people in a space they shouldn't occupy. His gaze lingered on me, soft but searching, as if he were waiting for a signal, for some unspoken permission to come closer. My heart raced in my chest, my mind spinning with thoughts I couldn't fully understand. And then, it happened. He gently reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers grazing my cheek. It was such an intimate gesture, too intimate for a father and daughter. Neither of us said anything, but the silence spoke volumes. We were balancing on a knife's edge, dangerously close to something neither of us could undo. And then, just as quickly as it began, the moment was shattered by the sound of the front door opening. Mom was home. The noise was like a thunderclap, pulling us both back to reality. My dad's hand dropped from my face instantly, and he stood up, the weight of what had almost happened hitting him all at once. My heart pounded as footsteps echoed down the hall. Mom's voice called out cheerfully, "I'm home." "Where is everyone?" I scrambled to gather the laundry, my hands trembling as I tried to make it look normal, casual. But it was no use. The tension between us hung in the air like a storm cloud, impossible to hide. Dad shot me a glance, one that seemed to say, "Don't say anything." He ran a hand through his hair, trying to compose himself, but the crack in his usual calm was clear. Before I could respond, the bedroom door swung open. There she was. Mom stood in the doorway, suitcase still in hand, wearing a tired smile that slowly faded as her eyes darted between us. She looked at me, then at Dad, and I knew instantly that she had sensed something. Something was wrong. What's going on? She asked slowly, narrowing her gaze as if trying to figure out what was going on. Nothing, Dad said quickly, his voice tight. We were just folding laundry. It was a simple excuse, but the tension in the room made it sound like a lie. Mom's eyes lingered on me for a moment, searching, and I felt my face flush under her scrutiny. Just folding laundry? She repeated, her tone now suspicious. She stepped further into the room, her sharp eyes scanning for clues we hadn't the courage to hide. I could see it in her expression, the way doubt flickered in her eyes, how she noticed the space between us was just a little too close. She might not have known exactly what had happened, but she sensed the intimacy hanging in the room. It's not what it looks like, I blurted out, my voice shaky. That only made it worse. Mom's expression hardened, her jaw tightening. She turned to Dad, and the look she gave him was one I'd never seen before. Hurt, anger, and disbelief all mixed together. Really? She whispered, her voice dangerously quiet. This is what I come home to? Dad shook his head. Nothing happened, I swear. But his words felt empty, and we all knew it. The truth was, nothing had happened, but something had almost happened, and the weight of that almost was heavy enough to break everything. Mom stared at us for a long moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, without a word, she turned and walked out of the room. The sound of her footsteps faded down the hall. I stood frozen, my heart racing in my chest. I wanted to say something, to explain, but there were no words that could make this better. Dad let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging under the weight of what we'd just lost. She knows, I whispered, barely audible. He nodded slowly. Yeah, she knows. We stood in silence, the gravity of what had happened and what had almost happened settling over us like a shadow. There was no turning back now. Things between us had changed forever, and no amount of pretending could ever make it right again.